Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Real Training for Free session. Nick Cavalanci here, sitting in for Randy Franklin Smith. Sorry for the late start on today's webcast. We had sort of a weird, unusual technical difficulty that arose just before with one of the speakers we were trying to rectify to make sure we bring you guys some really good quality education today. So really excited about today's topic. This is one of those topics where normally we rely on a solution, and then we find that even the solution that we tend to think is, I'll use the word commodity, but I think that's probably maybe has too much of a negative connotation to it. It sounds like it doesn't have value, but I mean, everybody thinks they need to have a PAM solution in place. Everyone knows that they should. They want to lock down administrative privileges, make sure there's no access to it inappropriately, et cetera, et cetera. But there's still some gaps. And one of the things that I've long said with security is every time you put a particular layer of security in place, you should assume that it's going to fail and look for other layers on top of it. Not meaning it's going to fail completely and it's horrible and don't bother putting in, meaning there's going to be some gaps even in that layer. And therefore you have to have some other means of verifying, validating that the one layer you put in is actually doing its job, and so on. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today with privileged access management, and just look at these blind spots that exist today. And so today's Real Training for Free session is made possible by the good folks at Silverfort, and we do have two great speakers from Silverfort joining us today. You're going to hear from them both later. Ron, I hope I'm saying this right. Ron, is it Rasin or Rasin? He's Chief Strategy Officer at Silverfort. Ron, which is it? How do you say your last name? And I apologize if I got it wrong.
Well, it's Ron Racine, but when I lived in
Racine,
the
see,
US, I was
way
always
off.
called Raisin, so you can go with Raisin,
Oh,
no
no,
worries.
I'm going to go with Racine because that's how you say it. See, I was way off.
Yeah,
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's important to say
no
people's
worries.
names right. Thought I'd ask. And then I hope I can get Kev's last name right. Kev Smith, is it? Or is it Smythe? It could be
Yeah,
Smythe. I
that's
don't know.
right.
He's from the UK. But he's
If you're
principal
fr-
engineer
if
at
you're
Silverfort. Kev, which is
where
it?
I'm from, it's Kev Smith with two F's. My South London accent.
Kev Smith. I would have never saw that one coming, but I'll take it nonetheless. A couple housekeeping items. As always, if you've been on any of our Real Training for Free webinars beforehand, today's session is being recorded. You will be sent out a link in a couple of days after the webcast with a recording link in case you want to share it with colleagues and so on. If you do have any audio issues, we have found typically with GoToWebinar, if suddenly you can't hear us or something, and assuming that you're using computer audio, because that's the only option we have, switch to phone audio and back to computer audio. That tends to take care of most of those issues. If not, just stick something in your chat, and Brendan, who is handling things behind the scenes, will attempt to address if he can. And then lastly is questions. As always, we try to take questions contextually throughout the webcast today. So as we're doing our different presentations here, having a bit of discussion in some cases, and you've got a question, a comment, an anecdote, a thought, an opinion, whatever it is you feel like sharing, stick that in the Q&A box. I have that box open up in front of me. And throughout today's webcast, if there's a question, again, if it seems contextual and we're still talking about it, we'll try to answer it then and there. We'll, of course, have some Q&A time at the very end. So if for some reason, either it's a question you've typed at the very end, we'll get to it then at the Q&A time. And if it just maybe is a question that came in slightly too late and we've sort of moved on topically, maybe we'll just wait to the end to ask that question as well. But we'll try to make sure we get every single question answered. So please feel free to kind of participate, as you always do, in today's webcast. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump in first, and I'm going to start by just sort of level setting the topic here and talking about what's sort of wrong with managing privileged accounts today, the way by which PAM attempts to address it and some of the problems that exist therein. And Kev and Ron, if it's okay, I might throw some questions your way, and at the same time, if you have some commentary, I welcome you both jumping in and providing some of that during my portion of the presentation. Would that be okay?
Cool.
Awesome. Appreciate
Absolutely.
that very much. Good. Glad to hear it. And so let's just jump in. And as always, I try to put in a couple of industry stats. It looks like I got my animations wrong because my second stat is showing, but I can still cover it anyways. And that is, this is a stat that actually comes from Networks' hybrid security trends report, and it was from this year. And in fact, I'm just going to put all three. There we go. I'll put all three up, and I'll read them left to right, and we'll do it that way. According to Verizon over on the left, credentials are still the top attack method. That was their report from last year. The one for this year has not come out yet. It's probably due out in a week to 2 or 3 weeks, something like that. It's typically right around the end of March, middle of April-ish. And if you're not reading any report, read this report every year. There's usually tens of thousands of security incidents and data breaches, and it's really statistically relevant data. It's worth taking a look at that report. So credentials are still the top attack method. Okay, so we've got that. Second, from the Network's Hybrid Security Trends report from this year, over half of the organizations they surveyed have experienced some kind of admin account compromise. Now, I'm making some interpretation here a little bit because they didn't mention anywhere in that report it's like the administrator account. I'm making an assumption that that wasn't necessarily that account, because in most organizations like your own, no one's necessarily logging in as administrator all the time. You're logged in with privileged accounts of some kind, or you have an account of your own that has access, or privileged access, that is, in addition maybe to your own user account, something along those lines. So I'm assuming it's something with privileged access. I might be wrong, but I think it's a safe bet to say I don't think half of organizations have had their administrator account, as the case would be, let's say, an Active Directory, compromised. And then the last one here is almost 2/3 of organizations. I put the word claim in here, but claim to have a PAM solution in place. And I put the word claim just because sometimes solution names mean different things to different people. And they might think that, some of you in the audience might say, well, a PAM solution has to have not only a vault, but has to have an ability to actually set up workflows and allow approvals of people to access certain accounts and have password rotation. And, and you start listing out the things in your mind that define a PAM, versus somebody's like, we have a password vault. And they go, that's a PAM. And you go, no, that's not. And so I sort of leave that with the word claim in there to kind of put a little slight caveat, like maybe they do, maybe they don't, but they have something that's there to manage their privileged access to those kinds of accounts here. Ron and Kev, I'm thinking about the stat in the middle. And being that you both are very well versed in attacks on privileged accounts, what's your thought? Do you think that's probably not administrator and it's some level of privileged access? Do you think actually the stat is higher in your own estimation or your own experience with customers? What's your thought in terms of the organizations and how likely a compromise of some kind of privileged and or the actual admin account is?
Well, I believe, again, since there's so many types of admins, that sounds, about right. It's definitely the target, and it doesn't need to be always like the keys to the kingdom, the famous domain admin and such. There's a lot of different admins that would give you great access to a specific application that's enough to access the whole user database of a certain organization. So there's a lot of important administrators that aren't necessarily, the tier 0 domain admin, for instance, but absolutely those are the targets.
That's a great point. Good, Kev, you have quite a good comment.
I was just going to add in there, we need to think about that it's not only user accounts here, but also what we quote as being non-human identities that would be a typical attack surface for an organization. So while yes, absolutely privileged users are a target, always consider your service accounts as well.
I would tend to agree. Any account that's going to give some level of ability to at least move laterally, let alone all the way up to and including keys to the kingdom, are necessary in order for threat actors to be able to do something. Andrew in our audience apparently is a bit cheeky today. He says, I generally think of the nonstick cooking spray when I think of PAM. And that is not the topic today, Andrew. Wrong answer. So you get a buzz on that one, but it's okay. A little bit of levity in the topic here. And so the real challenge here is when managing privileged accounts, there's a number of factors. I just drew my little sort of user account with a key, meaning there's some kind of admin. They have access to some resources on the side. Maybe it's a bunch of servers, or it's a database, or it's something in the cloud, or whatever it is. And some of the caveats here is once a privileged account has been established in many organizations, a lot of these questions that are below are actually never addressed and never thought through. So take, for example, how long has access been granted? Well, if we have, let's go back to Kev's example of like a non-human identity, like a service account. Let's say your backup service account. When's the last time somebody actually established the privileges for that account? It's like, we did that 12 years ago. Does anybody know what it has access to? And of course, the answer is no. which is the kind of the third bullet, which is it's undergone some kind of attestation. You're looking to see what kind of permissions it has, what access is granted in the second bullet. Is that access still needed? Should we remove it? Should we restrict it down to something lower? There's this idea of typically on the three bullets, the first three bullets, the problem with managing privileged accounts with the context of those three bullets of the first of the five is that they imply that no one's actually managing that account. They created that account, but none of you are actually managing it, is the thought. I'm not actually saying that all of you listening aren't, but if you answer those three questions as I don't know, or no, then you're not actually managing the privileged account at all. You're just simply creating one, and it's a set it and forget it, moving on. But then there's also this aspect of not just what is the account, what does it have access to, when was it last granted, is it the correct permissions, which is what the first three bullets are addressing, is the last half is really around what's it being used for, how's it being used, when's it being used, those kinds of questions, who's using it. And this is sort of teetering down the path of kind of like zero trust, although zero trust is of course really more about saying like, nope, we're going to verify and then we're going to trust you. But it's down that path of like going, we should be asking these questions. We should not just be blindly trusting because we gave, let's say, again, I'll stick with Kev's example, a service account, and I added in the backup admin or the backup service account as the example here, that just because we established it, bam, we should just trust it. It should have that access forever. Maybe it shouldn't. Maybe we should double check who's actually using it. When's it being used? What is it being used for? You know, and what even actions were taken, which is going into a whole nother webinar on like user behavior analytics and that sort of thing. But the point is, this is the problem. It's unless you have answers to these, you're not truly managing privileged accounts. Ron and Kev, when you're talking to customers, because I know that I'm going to sort of let the audience see a little bit behind the curtain here, you're able to actually see when privileged accounts are used. You're able to detect some lateral movement and when they're being used on different systems, and there's a lot of visibility in there. And I see that my questions really are about visibility. It's a different kind of visibility, but visibility nonetheless. When you're talking to customers, are you finding that they have answers for these questions? Are you finding that the answers are, I don't know, I mean, somebody did it a long time ago, and you know, it's basically no is the answer. What do you experience when you talk to prospective customers?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with that. I think most of the customers or prospects that I talk to, when I talk about the whole concept of discovery, people go, yeah, I'm not too sure. Like you said, that analogy of using a backup account from 12 years ago that would have lived in the corporate network for such amount of time, people were too afraid to maybe change it or look at it, or they don't necessarily understand what the account is doing. And that's something that we can do at Silverfort.
I'm actually curious for those of you in the audience, if you can answer some of these, like you act in your organization, you actually can do these. You have answers to these. I don't need the answers, but just like let me know which one you actually have answers to. I'm just curious to see, you know, if some of you do have like, oh, we know what access is granted. We do attestation. Just, I mean, it's not a poll. I don't have a poll to put up. I probably should have. That would have been probably kind of cool. But the other challenge that Kev, you just sort of got my memory thinking down a path is things like mergers and acquisitions, and we start having permission sprawl through trusts, SID history, you know, multiple domains, you know, from acquired companies, or we're the acquired company, whatever the case is. And then at some point, the idea of this, like what access is granted, or maybe I should say what access was granted, actually doesn't even apply anymore because it doesn't matter. We're 12 years later. We'll stick with our example here, and then it does, the permissions don't even look anything like they used to. Andre from our audience actually says, here's another important one. Where are they logging in from? They mentioned countries as an example. It's like, yes, it's not just who's using the credential, but where's it even at? And that's interesting because that actually goes down the path of like zero trust as well, where you're validating when someone's making a request for a privileged credential of some kind. That's on that path. Some of the tenets there is knowing that it's actually who you are, where you are, is this normal for you, those kinds of things. Kev, Ron, thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And another kind of story along those lines that, again, resonates a lot with customers, and they always kind of have a smile, yeah, that just happened to us, is, you know, in the case of privileged non-human identities, many times what you see is you get a an administrator, or it could be a developer or someone privileged, that would put his account into some kind of automated process, into some kind of script, and he's like, "Hey, just a POC. When we get to production, we'll fix it." Sure enough, 12
I know where
years
you're going
later,
now.
12 years later, and it's always 12 years later because no one notices as it happens. The guy leaves the job, or gets fired, or one time I'm telling the story, and the customer told me, I don't want to muddy the atmosphere, but we had a case where an employee passed away, and
Oh,
then
wow.
suddenly
Yeah.
you deprovision his account and things start breaking.
Yeah, and you can't exactly fix that very easily because you have to figure out everywhere it's been put in and so on. Those are all,
Exactly.
and the real problem here is that the privileged account also is about that one single account. Yes, multiplied, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, depending on what each of you listening in your organization you happen to have in terms of what you define as, I'm doing air quotes here, privileged. Because it could mean different things to different organizations. But in essence, these questions that I've got in front apply to like the individual account, one of those 10, 100, or 1,000 accounts. And the answer is, that's a great example, Ron, just that it might be something completely different where that account doesn't even exist anymore. And now we're going, how do we even fix that in the first place? Now, let me level set here for Andrew, who thought Pam was a cooking spray. I'm just joking. Andrew's sort of representing those that aren't thinking about Pam. I'm just level setting here. How Pam tries to attempt to mitigate misuse. You've got your low-level user on the left. They want to leverage privileged access. So they want to go access some of those things over on the right, the servers, the database, the cloud, the whatever it is. And so we put that privileged account inside and lock it away inside a PAM solution of some kind. And then presumably when the request is made, there's some set of criteria, maybe a workflow, maybe a permissions approval process where another person has to approve that the person on the left can utilize the credential in the middle, et cetera, et cetera. And we go through those criteria and then finally give them access to the resource. Now, to take it a step further, it could be they're given, here's the credential. It could be maybe you've got more of a PASM type of solution where there's session monitoring and management as well, where instead of just giving them access to the credential, they're actually given like a remote session to the resource in question, and they have no access to the credential itself. There's those kinds of things. And this set of controls definitely does provide value because it is ensuring that with that sort of that checklist that I've got in the bottom and what it represents is that something is monitoring the fact that this process is going to happen, that the user over here on the left is trying to access privileged credential there in the middle and says, whoa, let's double check a couple things. That's like, let me see your driver's license. What's your mother's middle name? I mean, just whatever they want to, it's obviously not asking those questions, but the point is there are these sets of checks that have to go through to ensure that before the privileged access is going to happen, where we're going to double check that. Just like when you call, I don't know, a credit card company or something, they're going to double check that you're actually you before they let you access and start doing things to your account. No different here. But then there's still some gaps that exist in this process here. And the gaps that exist are listed here. The first one is the fact that there's risk in just having standing privilege. That credential exists. And in theory, and I'm saying in theory, because the idea behind PAM is that PAM isn't necessarily locking down the use of that credential directly. Like it's not necessarily stopping people from utilizing the, let's say, administrator with the password of password, just go with it. In Active Directory, and someone just logs in as administrator with the password of password, it's not necessarily blocking that. It's just normally saying, if you'd like to access the administrator account, you have to come to me and you have to provide and actually meet the criteria that's in the checklist, meet the workflow, get the approval from the person, whatever the case is, and then I will give you access to the administrator account, and then provides it. But there's the biggest problem here is standing privilege. The fact that the account exists in the first place. Go back to the examples that we used, two of them. One was that developer that Ron brought up that either left or unfortunately passed away in one case and so on, or it's just the backup service account. Those are standing privileges. If a threat actor gets able to get their hands on one of those credentials somehow, they have keys to some part of the kingdom for sure. So the standing privilege in and of itself presents risk. Second one is just misconfiguration. There's still, I wish I actually paid attention in the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report. There was a stat in there about misconfigurations being responsible or participating in to a data breach. And I forgot what to find that stat here, but think about even a PAM solution has to be configured by somebody. And if there's misconfigured policies or workflows, it might be easier to gain access to a particular credential. That is certainly possible here. And then there's also what I put sort of what I'm calling assumed methods of access and an assumed lack of misuse. So what I mean by that is the assumed methods of access goes back to what I said earlier, that PAM generally is not there restricting you from using the administrator account with the password directly. It's just simply putting in some controls to let someone gain access to it. And so this is an assumed method of access. If a threat actor has some other way and they figured a way to gain access to the credential, give you an example, going back full circle to something Ron said early on, doesn't have to be like the administrator, it could be something with lower levels of privileges. What if it's an account that's an administrator over the virtual environment in which you run your domain controllers? And we'll just stick with Active Directory on-prem as the example here. So if I was a threat actor and I gained access to the administrator account over my VMware environment, and I have vSphere, and I have all my domain controllers running in vSphere, and I get administrator to that, in theory, if I do enough work, I could actually export out the entire Active Directory database and then start hacking against it, eventually break it, and then gain access to the credentials that are within. It's a long-tailed strategy, but it's still possible and it does happen. And so my point is, using PAM is an assumed method of access. That if someone's going to want to get a credential, they're going to go through PAM. They may not do that. And then also there's this assumed lack of misuse, where just because someone goes through PAM, assume that a threat actor figures out how to maybe provide the credentials, bypasses MFA, or gets access to someone else's MFA with prompt bombing or whatever it is. They're assuming that just because you go through PAM means that, oh, therefore the use after the fact is going to be appropriate. No, it doesn't. It doesn't at all. Andrew says, Andrew's changed his tune. It's no longer a cooking spray. He says it's sort of a key locker for elevated privileges. And in some ways, that's very true. There's a lot more than that, because there's things like password rotation that happen in some cases, like after every use, if you want to configure it that way. And by doing so, that means it's really difficult to log into administrator with the password if the password keeps rotating after every time somebody uses it. And so there are other things that it does to prohibit people from gaining access to privileged credentials outside and indirectly outside of PAM, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's foolproof. Ron and Kev, let me stop here for a second. Thoughts about what other gaps? I know that you've got some of the stuff you're going to talk about with the gaps in this methodology, but anything you'd want to add here that just whether it's something else I haven't talked about or something you think is actually important enough to note a second time?
Well, I think these are really great points, and we'll definitely highlight some of them as we talk through in the second part of the session. But absolutely, and I think that a lot of the gaps are even when you assume how someone is accessing, right? It's not even a matter of like a security problem. It's just for productivity. Think of an admin. He checks out his privileged credentials. He just wants to get his job done. It's not about an attacker even, but to get his job done the easiest way. Sometimes it's to check out credentials and not use the PAM. Go into the servers the easy way. Do some kind of batch process. Get productive as fast as possible. And then a lot of times what happens is PAM gets bypassed, and it's not by malicious intent, it's just the reality. And when that happens, really, the accounts get exposed.
That's a great point as well. Good, Kev.
I think leaning on my experience as well, and coming from an infrastructure engineering background before I went into vendor land, the challenge with most credential vaults or PAM vaults is if you put too many steps in the way of a clever administrator, they'll always do something to try and get around it. So there's absolutely, I think, a use case for having PAM vaults in enterprise organizations, but you need to be thinking smarter and harder and making the access easy but controlled at the same time. And maybe putting a privileged account in a vault is not always the right way to go around it.
Yeah, and what's interesting here is this is not a PAM bashing session, by the way, for those of you
No, of
listening.
course not.
Even Kev's last statement is not, he's not saying PAM sucks, don't use it. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying that there are restrictions. I mean, there are limitations to how much it can protect. Ulrich mentioned something interesting. Ulrich says solution, SIEM. He's saying get a SIEM solution. But that, of course, means you have to have some kind of logging, and there has to be logging for the specific activity that's being done. But certainly you can do it for logons, but it also requires that servers have logging, and that logging is being directed to the SIEM solution and so on. But not wrong, just there's a bit of caveat to that answer. And then Ed says, what about PAM administrators? So you get those accounts, access to those accounts. You don't have access to all the accounts within, no. And I would say yes and no. And here's an example. You put an account into a PAM solution under management of a PAM solution, and it rotates the password immediately. There's nothing you really have access to necessarily. I guess you could, in theory, grant somebody access to that credential and that sort of thing. It depends on the solution if there's safeguards. I don't know, because I can't talk about every PAM solution because I don't have them all memorized. But that's not bad thinking though either. Just to go, what about the folks that set this thing up in the first place? If I get access to that credential, does it or does it not? And it's something you'd have to ask your PAM vendor. And then Damon has an interesting commentary here. Damon says for organizations who feel, and Damon puts compliance in quotes here, who feel compliance is the goal rather than the baseline. I think maintaining evidence or reluctance to create a more compliance paperwork, or to create more compliance paperwork, prevents them from changing those types of stagnant passwords. Meaning, one more reason for why people don't go back to the backup service account and change it is because they're already compliant with whatever mandate, GDPR, CCPA, or HIPAA, or whatever it is, and it's going to require more paperwork. But then Damon says, how would PAM meet those baseline account needs while removing the burden of proof for compliance evidence? I'm going to answer this as generically as I can, and then Ron and Kev, if you have commentary, I'd love to have you answer the question as well. In this case, the PAM becomes let's say for the sake of argument, that in your compliance mandate, and I'm speaking generally, I'm not talking about any specific mandate, but you have some kind of standard you'd have to adhere that says privileged accounts have to be kept secure or something like that. Or the passwords have to be a certain level of security, something along those lines. But there's nothing about PAM specifically in the compliance mandate. PAM would be considered a compensating control, if you will, in that case. I mean, you have to define in the I'm going to call it, you said compliance paperwork, so I'm going to call it documentation, if you will. The documentation you put in place is you establish that we are compliant because we have all of these specific privileged accounts in a PAM solution that utilizes these technologies like password rotation and has workflows and policies to restrict access and blah, 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 blah. And that becomes the definition. That is the standard. It's not the fact that the password is a complex password of 20 characters, it's alphanumeric and has a special character, and or whatever, right? And again, I'm sort of making this up more as an example than a specific action you'd have to take. And so, but think about PAM being like that compensating control, because you're meeting that need for sure. So I think from a compliance standpoint, that's what you're doing. In fact, you're probably doing a better job that way, because compliance is, of course, just check boxes, and security is a ever-moving target. It's a fluid thing. And by giving it a definition of something that can be fluid, like PAM, all the passwords will be secure in PAM. We don't care what the passwords are anymore. We just say there's a policy that they're 20 characters and they're alphanumeric and blah, 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 and special characters, and you're good, as opposed to a single account or a single standard and so on. So I hope that answers your question. Kev, Ron, anything to add? And if you don't, that's okay, but I thought I'd just ask to see if you have any commentary on that question. I'll take that as a no. So keep going. That's fine. No worries. So and then Kev mentioned, or maybe Ron mentioned, I forget, one of you mentioned non-human identities, and we can't forget about those at all. Those are the ones that are representing something other than a person. That's really what it is. And we mentioned service accounts. I think Kev mentioned machines. The idea of the developer sticking their credentials in as part of some of their code, could be part of an API key of some kind, or something else. It's anything where it doesn't represent literally me. It doesn't represent my access to the network or the resources therein. It represents something that isn't a person. And the reality is, and you can see here, and this is where the problem exists. You see, it's the epitome of standing privilege, because it is. It's, again, I think all of you, let's put it this way, none of you ever said like, no, we don't keep our backup service accounts, and they haven't had permissions for 12 years. Yes, they have. Everyone's the same way. I mean, maybe one of you, and if you did, I'll applaud you here, because it just doesn't happen. And then there's also no oversight of how they're used. Case in point, the example that Ron gave that was very real world. The developer passed away. Nobody knew. There was no oversight on the use of that particular credential used as part of the development. And then there's also no accountability. Unlike with PAM, at least there's some kind of accountability where you put in workflows, you can put in the approval processes and so on. And then again, if you take it a step farther, the accountability into the visibility into when is that credential used, on what system was it used, and so on. Mm-hmm. And that's good. The visibility is what's necessary here, but just kind of keep in mind that PAM is designed purely for human-based identities. Kev, anything you'd add here, since I think NHIs was the thing that you brought up initially?
Yeah, I think this kind of concept around standing privilege is super important, especially in the way that we approach stuff with our new privileged access service as well. People tend to go down this route and think about, we could do privilege escalation management, where you can turn around and say, these users can only run these commands, etc. But it's a never-ending circle. So I've never seen that successfully implemented. So the concept of standing privilege is super important for any of the conversations that we have here at Silverfort.
I would agree. That is the basis for the problem. Go ahead, Ron, please.
And one thing to add with non-human identities is where, at least in the human case, you get some interaction. You have a human, you put him, you make sure you get an FA. There's more friction in a good way with the account. These could be accounts doing some process running in the background for a year. So you don't know that what's wrong with them until something breaks. They really are invisible. And a lot of security controls don't even make sense here. So as I said, MFA is great for humans, but what do you do with the machines, right? It doesn't make sense there. So in some ways they're even harder to protect because you don't have a human on the end to prompt.
No one to yell at. Ulrich mentioned something. Yeah. He did call me out on something, and I do appreciate that it was mentioned, or it does mention, of course, PAM can handle service accounts and change passwords. Yeah, because you got password rotation, and PAM solutions can go out as long as they know where there's discovery been done and they know where the account's being used. They can go to the servers that, let's take the backup account as the example, and every server that backup account is used on, change the password in the service that it's associated with. So 100% correct. Just wasn't thinking of it in that term, but Ulrich is correct. So Ulrich, you get a bonus point today. I don't know what that even means, but I gave you a bonus point. So Ulrich is smiling. Yes, bonus point.
But I'll just add on that point, if I could comment on Ulrich's comment, that we do run into companies that started or tried their journey with rotating service accounts. The only problem, when it works, it works. The only problem is, what they run into in many cases. Let's say if the same account is used by multiple applications or multiple clients, if for some reason the rotation didn't work even on one, there's something didn't work well, and not all of the clients were updated with the rotated credentials, they will try a wrong password essentially, and then it will just lock out the account, and it basically breaks the rest. So that happens a lot. If you, as in many cases, use the accounts in multiple places, so it's not that straightforward.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to what Ron was saying, is absolutely no, there's no reason why you shouldn't potentially put a service account into a vault and have the credentials rotated. But leaning on my real world experience and conversations that I've had, I've certainly had organizations turn around and say, well, yeah, we've got 70% of our non-human identities being rotated, but the other 30%, the application owners are so worried about that password checkout, check-in process breaking because the application is business critical, that they go and get exceptions to the rule. And it only takes one of those accounts to have a certain level of privileges where it's not rotated, that could be an attack surface for somebody to go in and claim elevation rights.
Valid point. Sort of a service availability of the PAM solution in the first place, if you will. So
and the application as well. You know, somebody says it's my business critical application. I don't want to have my service account put in the vault, because if the vault breaks or the checkout process breaks, we can't pay salaries, for example.
can be bad.
They tend to get exceptions.
Yeah. So let's want to kind of summarize it this way: is PAM is certainly necessary, but when you think about it, PAM is actually worried about the privileged credential. It doesn't really manage or protect the access, the privileged access, and so the privileged access itself remains standing. That doesn't address privilege sprawl. And it doesn't rely on just-in-time access, which would be the opposite of standing privilege, which would be let's grant the privileges when you need it at the moment you need it and take it away when you're done. And so, and that kind of idea of just-in-time access is something that we're going to talk a little bit more about here. And the goal ultimately, though, so I can give you guys some time because we started a little late here, so I'm going to keep going, Ron and Kev, is your goal here is continually have discovery to know what's where, try to figure out how you're going to establish zero standing privilege, leverage just-in-time privileged access instead. So again, identifying what privileges are out there, see if you can take them away, grant them when needed, but then yes, you still continue to use PAM because those are the accounts that would be granted the privileged access just in time. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to Ron and Kev. They're going to talk about some of the blind spots we've talked about here and do a little bit more of a deep dive into something that they refer to as privileged access security and look for better ways to discover and manage the privileged accounts across your entire organization. So with that, I believe, Kev, I'm making you presenter. Is that right?
Well, we can try. Just full transparency, I'm not sure if my screen sharing is going to work, so
Okay.
we can try. Ron's got a deck I think he wants to talk about as well. So
Yeah.
Okay, so who wants to go first? That was the technical difficulty we had early on, folks. So sorry about that. Who wants to go first? Then let's go ahead and make sure we pass you presenter rights.
I guess start with me, right, Kev?
yeah, go
All
for
right.
it, Ron.
All right,
And then we'll
so
keep
Ron,
our
I'll go ahead and make
fingers
you
crossed when
presenter,
I
and
pass
let's
it
see
to
where we
you.
go. All right, awesome. So Ron, I'll make you presenter, and then I'll let you know when I can see your screen.
Can you see?
I can see your screen. You're good. The floor is yours, Ron.
Yep.
And now, of course, if
Okay.
there's questions that you guys want to come in and ask while Ron's presenting, feel free to do those. Ron, I may interject, a question or two while you're presenting and so on. So, take a breath in between slides or whatnot, and I'll try to interject without interrupting. Sound good?
Yeah, let me try to make you see the right part of the screen. Maybe now can you see it better? Okay.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Yep,
Yes, you
good.
Oh,
see the slideshow.
Okay, great. So again, what we tried to do at Silverfort is we really looked at PAM again. It's a standard in the industry. We asked a lot of our customers, where are the pain points, and again, I think we really discussed a lot of them right now. I'll lean over them, and then it brought us to think of how we can do this and help solve privilege access security and in a different way. How can we help ensure that PAM is kept secure, and in places where you don't have PAM, then maybe there's a different way to handle things, and that's where we're coming from. So again, why is protecting privilege access so hard? And we talked about a lot of this now. I think many companies have a hard time due to a lot of inherent limitations that really make the accounts exposed. So I think the first thing, and you just mentioned that now, is the discovery gaps. It's just hard to find all the privileged users. I know you all have in mind, I have my domain admins, or I have my Entra or Azure admins, or my cloud admins. Those are the obvious ones, right? Those are like the highest level of privileged users, and they're great, but there's so many administrators for different applications, for different servers that are just lying around. And on top of that, there's a lot of administrators that aren't officially administrators, but if they have an administrative access, or they can access in an administrative manner, they're just as good as administrators, right? They're de facto administrators. So that's one thing that's a problem. The second thing is, we did some surveying, and we surveyed, I think, around 650 different customers, different, not necessarily customers, but different companies, and only 10% said that they got to the finish line with their PAM project. They said, yeah, we're done, we're good, we're fully implemented. So even with the benefits that PAM brings, usually it's a never-ending rollout, right? And that's an important part. Then another thing, and we mentioned this, it's not even out of a malicious intent. PAM gets bypassed for productivity reasons. Sometimes things need to get done. It's just easier not to work through PAM. It makes things more cumbersome. So people will just go around. Why walk straight through when you can just go around pretty easily, check out a credential, and do what you need to do. And last but not least, again, in many cases, admins use their privileged accounts to do other tasks, and it's just human nature, right? You got in the PAM, you're in a privileged session, you got it approved, and you're like, okay, I'm in a privileged session, I might as well get all the work I need to do done and continue. So you end up getting accounts used not for their intended purpose, just out of convenience. And so this is kind of the summary of the blind spots. I want to hit on any comments, questions, and before I dive into, and I think this repeats a lot of what we said earlier. But any questions before I dive into our approach?
No, keep going.
Okay. All right. So our approach really is that we try to take these problems and figure out how we can help organizations out with them. So first of all, our privilege access security model discovers privileged users automatically and continuously. There's a lot of tools that scan for privileged users, but what we are, our focus is to understand who are privileged based on actual access, based on what they're actually doing, not what they can do in theory. So we do that automatically, and then we classify them by tiers. I don't know if we didn't mention that there. It's one. The Microsoft tiering model is one, I'd say, popular method, to classify different types of admins into different levels. The concept makes sense regardless if you use the tiering model or not. The idea is the most privileged users that are accessing, let's say, your identity infrastructure, should only be accessing your identity infrastructure, like domain admins, and they shouldn't be used for anything else. So it's kind of separating between the concept means separating between the different roles of administrators and only using them for their intended purpose, and nothing else. So the Microsoft tiering model is a popular framework for this, but the concept really is for any privileged user. It makes sense. Any administration of privileged users. And another thing we do is we call out when cross-tier authentication has been performed. So that out of that proper tier where the account is supposed to be used, we'll highlight that, we'll call it out. The next thing, not only is the visibility, and that's the first step to everything, but then we want to actually technically limit what a privileged account can do. So really lock it down, and that's capability that Silverfort has as part of our access to domain controllers and your identity infrastructure. We can actually limit what an account could do only to its intended purpose. So a domain admin can only access domain controllers. And we can also limit where it's used from. So maybe we'll limit an account, if you have a PAM in place, only to be used from the PAM, not allow it to be bypassed. If you don't, we can limit it to anywhere. And another thing that we do here is we actually can limit how it's used. So if you say, all right, my privileged accounts should only be using secure protocols. It's hard to get rid or completely get rid of less secure protocols and ciphers from your network, although you want to get there. But for privileged users, you can draw the line in the sand and say, hey, they will not use any protocol that's not, Kerberos or LDAP, secure LDAP, but nothing that's not at a higher security standard. And we could do that. Just flip the switch and limit what they can use to only secure protocols. And this is how you really reduce, risk and the attack surface in a very scalable manner, right? The idea is to limit how much damage can happen with each of these accounts, right? To only what they're supposed to do. And then the last part of this, is really to completely make privilege accounts unusable until they're needed. And this is called, just-in-time access. It's a concept that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And the idea is, instead of just having the accounts lying around, potentially waiting to get compromised, this way they're unusable. They're just disabled. They completely cannot be used until the exact point in time where they need to be used, where you verified your identity and the account gets enabled and it can be used and you're good to go. So the concept of this concept really reduces the attack surface dramatically. I can share a story that a conversation that I had with a cyber insurance vendor, I think a year and a half ago. Partner of ours that sells cyber insurance. I'm sure a lot of you have have cyber insurance, and they have an insurance background, and I asked them. I saw a questionnaire that they send to their to companies that they want to cover, and one of the questions in the questionnaire is, how many domain admins do you have, or generally admins do you have? And I'm like, why is that interesting? And they told me, if you have more admins, we'll charge you a higher premium because you're more likely to be breached. And I was rubbing my head. I'm like, you guys, I understand you're from the insurance industry, but it's not how things work, right? Like, the right question is, how secure are those admins? And then he comes back and he tells me, I understand you're thinking from a cybersecurity perspective, but from the insurance perspective, think of car insurance. What are the chances you get in a car accident if you're a taxi driver driving 24/7, the car is driving all the time, versus you take the car out for 15 minutes a week? Where are you more likely to get in an accident? And that's the prism in which insurance looks at things, and it has a lot of and I kind of said, okay, I get that it does have a lot of it does make a lot of sense. If the accounts are disabled 95% of the time, they are less likely to be a breached, full stop. So I really relate to that. And also when we discuss this with a lot of our cyber insurance partners, they were blown away, because they were like, listen, when this gets implemented, we statistically can lower the premium we charge. It translates into guaranteed less payout that we would need to pay in breaches. So that's the idea with just in time, and make sure there's zero standing privilege. That's kind of the last piece to our approach of addressing these gaps. Now, this works very well with existing PAM solutions. So it works on top, it layers as another layer of security, or it's great if in places where you couldn't roll out PAM or you don't have PAM, it's also there. It doesn't do all the things that a PAM solution does, but we believe it does the right things from a security aspect. And so that's it from my side. And next, I'll pass it over to Kev. Hopefully, he'll be able to share screen. And if not, we'll try to show you some kind of recording. So I'm going to stop. Oh.
And let's have a look to see if this is going to work. No, I can't. I'm still unable to share on, unfortunately.
Okay.
Sorry.
So what I'll do is I'll get back and sharing. I'll show you a short video of kind of the user experience here. I'm sure a lot of you are asking, how does all this and how does all this happen? So I'll go ahead and share. And maybe Kev, you want to talk through a little bit how this looks on the site. I'll just play this
Yeah,
slowly
sure.
and okay, show this window. Are we good? Okay.
All right, cool.
Um,
Okay. So let's just set the scene here. This is privileged access security in full flow. What we're going to show you here is that concept of an account with 0 standing privileges, i.e. the account is disabled in Active Directory. So it doesn't matter if I was a hacker and I'd stolen the credentials. This account cannot be used without the workflow that we're going to show you. So if you want to hit play on. I'd say John's just going to try and do a simple RDP to a server using an administrative account. He's going to enter his normal credentials that he knows about.
sorry, I replayed. I apologize.
Oh, did you? Okay, no problem. And in the PAS world, the credential could have been checked out from a vault, like a PAM vault, or it might be a credential that John knows. The world's slowest typer. Okay, so just pause it here, Ron, for me. Okay, so a couple of things are happening here. First of all, the Windows operating system is going to go to the domain controller and ask for permissions for John and check John's credentials are right. AD's turned around and said, yeah, I'm happy with the credentials. However, John-A, your account is disabled. Silverfort has a relationship with the domain controller. We see the request come in. And because John-A is said to be an account under PAS control, we're triggering what's called a workflow. And you can see that there's a pop-up coming up on the screen here saying, hey, John, are you trying to connect with your admin account? Okay, so this is an important but also an interesting workflow event here is that we need to put a justification in. It's optional, but coming from an operational background, I see having a justification for why John-A needs the account. Should be logged, can be fed into the SIEM tool as you configure it, or it can fed into the notification engine of Silverfort. And here you can see that John's triggering an access request. And effectively what we're doing now is going back to the domain controller and we're enabling the account on demand. So when Ron mentioned the just-in-time model earlier on, we're directly going to enable the account. There is no replication delays that are needed to be involved as far as the Active Directory environment is concerned. And because with Silverfort, we know exactly where that authentication request came through. And you can see now that John is able to carry out the RDP. In the lab or in the PAS service, you would be able to see that the account is showing as enabled. There is a countdown timer. There is a reference to the justification, as I've just said. And what I wanted to show you as well today, and unfortunately I can't, is this concept of virtual fencing, which I think is super, super powerful. And when we talk about virtual fencing, it is really about us identifying where the authentication has come from and where is it going to. And Ron put it rather eloquently earlier regarding, maybe a domain admin or an enterprise admin. We only want them to come from maybe a privileged access workstation or a server that's classed to be an admin jump box. And we turn around and say, okay, you can only come from that server, and you're only ever allowed to log on to domain controllers. You can't go to a web server or an app server or a tier 1 resource, for example, using that highly privileged account. And again, just to reinforce what Ron was saying as well, is that from our point of view, the best practice is around ensuring that those privileged accounts are only forced to use the right protocol. I think Ron mentioned LDAP-S, and we often see that organizations want to ensure that privileged accounts are using something like Kerberos as well. And then getting further down into the weeds, we can turn around and say to Active Directory, this user, John-A, can only request an RDP, or he can only request a PowerShell connection, but he can't use his privileged account to maybe connect to a database, for example. And that's what we mean when we talk about doing the tiering of resources. We facilitate you to adopt that should you want to do so. We introduce the concept of virtual fencing. Again, that can be optional, can be applied to highly privileged users or just regular users. And then built on top of that is the just-in-time workflow, where we can have the account permanently disabled. And Ron's analogy about driving a taxi, I kind of use the same thing, in that, it's much better to have the car keys locked in a cupboard, and you just go and get the keys out of the cupboard and get in your car and drive your car, rather than have your car sat on your drive with the door open and the engine running. So that's the kind of analogy that I always refer to when we talk about that JIT model. So while tiering is important and the virtual fencing is important, to me the JIT model, the fact that we can do it almost instantaneously, is a real game changer for people who want to look at an alternative to a PAM or reinforce their PAM investment that they've got already. So I just wanted to quickly summarize what we've just shown on that video there, and then open it up for any Q&A.
There's currently no questions that are coming. We have some questions that are earlier on from audience, and I think I'll try to bring some of those in here. And maybe you guys can also answer this question more so in the context of what you've talked about a little bit and how you might be able to help, if at all. But Damon's asking about how PAM works with IoT assets. And it says some have minimal password capabilities, thinking electronic grid devices. So the question there with PAM, and obviously, is whether or not it has an ability, some API access or some kind of access to a given IoT device. Do you have any visibility into that kind of use of a credential if an IoT needed to use some kind of privileged credential at all?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, the way that Silverfort works is that we feed off of the authentication event. So if the grid management console was using a legacy protocol, something like Radius, for example, ultimately, if you look down the tree of the authentication event, potentially there is Active Directory that would be involved, and we would see that authentication event. And potentially you could then trigger the JIT model for accessing those IoT management consoles. But fundamentally, it's about us seeing the metadata from the event and being able to do something with it.
And then Eric asked, go ahead, Ron, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you.
Just to add on, in the IoT world, I think, what I mentioned around, the worry around getting a service account or rotating their passwords. In the IoT world, it's really, just don't break anything. Don't break anything is above everything, because, that could have implications on safety. And that's where the rotation approach just doesn't work. Like the risks are too high, and they're actually, looking to just limit what a certain account could do. Like with virtual fencing is a much more, I'd say a much safer approach.
Another question came in from, oops, I think I just deleted someone had asked a question about non-human identities. I accidentally deleted it. I want to say it was Eric. Asked the question again, whoever just asked the question about non-human identities. I'm sorry, I hit delete on accident here. Patrick asked, does the discovery scan also work for local accounts and database accounts? That is non-AD accounts.
So in what we showed you now, it's focused on AD accounts, and we're also adding in support for Windows local accounts and more down the line. So at this point, it's those.
Okay. And Humphrey says, is there any way that PAM can be used to manage the rotation of passwords for service accounts which tend to have non-expiring passwords? And I think the answer there, the simple one is, if you have a policy that says that a password has to be changed every certain, based on the PAM solution, password rotation can be defined based on timing usually, or usage, a combination therein. And so in theory, yes, it should be able to. I guess it just depends on the solution in question. So I can't give you a definitive answer because it's not every solution is the same. Anything you guys want to add, Kev, Ron?
No, I don't think so.
All right. Then who is this? This is Eric said, okay, thank you, Eric, for retyping that. I appreciate you. Eric says, can you share more about non-human identity side? Is it primarily service accounts, or are there more use cases to consider? What do you guys normally see?
Well, in the product today is the two different types of NHIs. It's service accounts and machine accounts. So a machine account is an operating system asking for an authentication event from the directory. So we class that as a kind of a non-human identity. The other non-human identity really is around service accounts themselves. And the core functionality of Silverfort is this ability to understand and correlate from an authentication event and differentiate between what is a real human user and what is a non-human identity, as they're called now. And that discovery and visibility, as I said, is core to the platform. And we often, when I'm talking to prospects or doing sort of larger scale POCs, we always start off with a discovery process just to understand what authentications are occurring, where they're coming from, where they're going to, what permissions that they might have stored in Active Directory, and also how frequently are they authenticating. So I kind of boil Silverfort down into three words. I talk about discovery, investigation, and then protection. But that could be for both human users and non-human users. And PAS is an extension of that model.
Yeah, and I'll just add on, I think, that's one of the things that, we really believe in, and that's why we're extending everything we do into the cloud also. And we recently acquired another company that focused on cloud identity. And the idea, of what we're adding in is also that, you need to look at human, non-human, but also cloud and on-prem, because the attackers, they don't really care. It's all our problem. The fact that there's identities that are used across cloud and on-prem, across SaaS applications. At the end of the day, an attacker will sprawl around and laterally move as much as possible, and we have to give a unified layer of first visibility, like Kev said, and then really protection.
And I'll just add another little, little bit of analogy into this. I was talking to a certain tobacco company. It actually makes Arnold Schwarzenegger's stogies, and they're a customer of ours. And he was explaining how, under a specific attack scenario that they were under, the hackers actually got into their network 3 months beforehand, and then decided to go and leave the network, and then they came back in after a certain period of time as well. So there's always this kind of understanding, and the fact that we're continually discovering and investigating those authentications is super key to understanding what's going on in your network as part of that discovery flow.
Another question came in from Pablo, and Pablo says, interesting concept of just-in-time based on disabled accounts. Have you experienced issues related to propagation times or so trying to enable identities temporarily? Also, have you experienced ambiguity from auditing reporting perspective to make distinctions between users decommissioned versus disabled ones due to this approach?
So that's a great question. I think first on the first part of it, and because we have, as Kev said, a relationship with domain controls, we can really make sure that this happens quickly and promptly, and we don't rely on in some large organizations replications could take a long time. And so that's one capability that we tuned. Another thing is we mark the accounts in a way that you can report on. We mark the accounts that are kind of disabled by Silverfort in a way that you can report on, so you know who are disabled in an unrelated way versus ones that we are managing and handling. So great question.
So I'll just add another little bit. Another little bit of colour to that is that I was talking to another big financial organisation as a customer of ours, and in their tier 0 world, they have a very capable and configured PAM solution. And that PAM solution actually logs onto the endpoints and provisions an account on demand. And then that account is then put into the PAM vault and made available for somebody to go in and check out. And they did it that way because their specific auditors asked them to not have any accounts with privileges or access to the tier 0 assets. And when we introduced PAS and the concept of having a disabled account rather than an account provisioned on demand, they all agreed that would appease their internal auditors in a better way and a lighter and more robust way than relying on a solution to try and do some sort of low-level programming to create an account on demand. So the account enablement and disablement, in my view, is much more powerful than providing an account on demand. And that also mitigates the previous scenario you was mentioning about Active Directory replication. With PAS, we don't have that relationship or worry.
Pablo says thank you. So I think you got the answer that he wanted to hear. Martin's asking, is this an agent-based solution, and are you using an agent to enforce the virtual geofencing?
Okay. So Silverfort is an agentless solution. The only service, and I'm going to call this out, people often call it an agent, but it is a Windows service. The Silverfort Windows service sits on the domain controller. It doesn't run in kernel space, it runs in user space. And we developed this, Ron, you might want to add a little bit more color, out of a relationship that we've got with Microsoft. So we're effectively taking the source and the destination and passing it to Silverfort, and Silverfort can see the source and the destination in the event, and then we can turn around and say, this is an allowed authentication event or it's not an allowed authentication event. Therefore, all we're doing is acting as a second opinion to the directory without you having to distribute any agents or other services onto the endpoints in your infrastructure.
Great answer. Let's see. Martin says, very cool. I like that I get to hear the voice of the audience.
Yeah, I like to hear those responses too.
Yeah, very good there. So any other questions you guys have, keep them coming in here. Is there any call to action that you all have? I know there's no slides up necessarily, that are that you want folks to. You got a Q&A slide up at the moment. Is there any call to action slide you'd like them to take a look at next if they're interested?
I neglected that slide, but let definitely silverfort.com and reach out to us, and we'd absolutely love to dive in and show you more, and mention that you saw us here, and we'd love to continue the discussion.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And,
What other question came in? Good, Kev. Good. It's fine.
I was just going to just reinforce again what Ron said. If you go onto the silverfort.com website, there are interactive demos of PAS there that you can walk through. You can click the buttons. We can show you what's going on in the background. We can show you how things get configured. They're really great, nice way to get a look and feel and understanding of not only PAS, but all the other components of the Silverfort engine.
One other question came in. Happy to keep those questions coming in. I'm just sort of buying some time in case any of you were typing them, and obviously they were. Jennifer is asking, what are the best practices for separation of admin accounts on other platforms other than AD? Come across that with any of your customers?
Well, I think that the principles are the same principles, like the concept of separation of privileges is always, is always important. You always want an account per use case. That is something that's always important. No matter where it is. That's a key concept. And always, add in, make sure you have MFA and strong authentication. That's like the kind of the most basic things to do at the minimum.
And I think as well, just to add to what Ron was saying, he mentioned earlier on that we've Silverfort acquired a company called Resonate that does a lot of this security posture management, identity threat detection in the cloud across all of the identity providers. So in the next release that's coming out, we've got the concept of cloud NHI discovery. And then as we kind of move forward into the latter part of this year, you're going to see the Resonate platform merged in. So somebody I spoke to the other day actually likened the PAS model we were just talking about to kind of like Entra PIM. And while Entra PIM is great for doing Entra, what about Okta? What about Ping? What about AWS? What about those other infrastructure as a service providers? And you're going to see us extend more out into that space to cover not only Active Directory, but all the cloud side of things as well.
Another question came in. This one's from Eric. Eric says, actually, I mentioned, I called it Azure PIM, but it's fine. And then also mentioned Intune EPM, Endpoint Privilege Management. So maybe rather than just asking how does your solution compare to them, I think maybe the question here really is, how does it compare with, with a PIM solution, with a privilege management solution on front endpoint? How is this different? Can you talk about it maybe more generically?
Yeah, I think the Entra piece is an interesting scenario. We've already got a relationship with Entra in the multi-factor authentication that we can trigger as part of the Silverfort platform can be either push-based, i.e., it can go to Ping ID or Hyper or the Silverfort mobile app, for example, or we can bridge the authentication off to Entra. And when we talk about bridging the authentication off, what we effectively say is Ron's trying to do an RDP with a privileged account. He puts in his justification. When he puts in the justification, the decision engine can be handed off to Entra. We call a same as a My Apps SAML2 application, and you can apply conditional access to that application in the same way as you would do now. Is the device enrolled? What's the geolocation? What other conditional access rules need to apply before Ron's account is enabled by the PAS JIT model? We can do that also for regular types of MFA, like for legacy applications, for example. And one particular use case always springs to mind with a manufacturer who had a legacy application that was running on a factory floor, and the cyber insurance people turned around and said, you need to have MFA. It was a thick client. They couldn't change the code. It was very old. But we came in and said, okay, let's see the authentication events and let's push When the authentication event come in, we can trigger a secondary factor, whether it be push, in that use case, I think it was, or whether we want to hand it off to any identity provider. I've called out Entra here, but it could be Ping, it could be, it could be Okta. We support all of the major IDPs in that scenario. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think what I want to make sure is you're understanding is the decision for the MFA can be handled by another engine. It doesn't necessarily have to be Silverfort.
Wonderful. Looks like that's at the end of the questions that have come in. If you're still typing a question in, feel free to keep doing that. We're going to go ahead and close things out, but someone from Silverfort will reach directly out to you. Make sure you get your question answered. Do want to thank Silverfort for sponsoring today's Real Training for Free session. Ron, Kev, great presentation. Kev, sorry there was a bit of weird technical difficulty. I think you're able to at least you got your point across. I think it certainly wasn't the demo I know you wanted to do, but I'm glad you're able to do some kind of presentation as opposed to, okay, guys, here's some finger puppets. Imagine this shadow is that would have been mad. And at least you did something. It's really good. Appreciate your time, both of you. And this is going to go ahead and conclude today's webcast. Thanks, everyone, for attending, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, everyone, for your time. Really appreciate it today.
Thank you, everyone.